What if the one thing they couldn't forget wasn't the biggest moment you shared, but the moment they almost overlooked completely? That's what has been happening lately. Somewhere, someone truly believed they had reached the end of a chapter. They believed enough time had passed. Life had become busy. New responsibilities filled their days. New experiences demanded their attention. Little by little, they stopped expecting your memory to appear. In their mind, everything was moving exactly the way it was supposed to. The past was the past, and the future was waiting ahead. But then, something unexpected happened. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't life-changing in the moment. It was a simple reminder hidden inside an ordinary day. Maybe it was a familiar phrase. Maybe it was a certain place. Maybe it was a moment that carried an energy they hadn't felt in a very long time. Whatever it was, it unlocked a memory of you with a clarity that caught them completely off guard. Not just the memory itself, but the feeling attached to it. And listen to this. What unsettled them wasn't that they remembered. It was how alive the memory still felt. The details returned effortlessly. The emotions returned naturally. For a brief moment, it felt as though time had never passed at all. They couldn't understand why this particular memory had survived when so many others had faded away. Yet the more they reflected on it, the more they realized this wasn't just a random thought returning. It was the beginning of a realization they were not prepared to face. And listen carefully, because what happened next was not what they expected. Most people assume that when a memory returns, it appears once and then disappears again. That's what they thought too. They believed it was simply one of those random moments when the mind revisits the past for no particular reason. At first, they paid very little attention to it. They acknowledged the memory, shrugged it off, and continued with their day. But something strange began happening afterward. The memory didn't leave. Instead, it lingered quietly in the background, almost like a song that continues playing long after the music has stopped. The unusual part wasn't the memory itself. It was the timing. They couldn't understand why it was appearing now. Nothing significant had happened. There was no special anniversary, no major event connected to you. Life was moving normally. Yet despite that, this one memory seemed determined to remain present. Every time they thought it had finally faded, something would bring it back. Not in dramatic ways, in subtle ways. A passing thought, a familiar feeling, a brief moment of silence when their mind wasn't occupied by 100 other things, because your heart needs this right now. Some memories survive because they are attached to emotions that were never fully understood. They don't return to disrupt our lives. They return because there is still something hidden inside them waiting to be recognized. This person is beginning to discover that truth for themselves. As the days passed, they started noticing a pattern. The memory wasn't arriving alone anymore. It was bringing other memories with it. One moment reminded them of another, one feeling connected to another. Before long, they found themselves revisiting parts of the past they hadn't thought about in a very long time. Not because they wanted to live in those memories, but because the memories kept finding their way back to them. It was as if one small thread had been pulled, and now an entire tapestry of forgotten moments was slowly revealing itself. What confused them most was how specific everything felt. Out of all the experiences life had given them, why this one? Out of all the people they had known, why were thoughts of you returning with such persistence? They searched for logical answers. They tried convincing themselves it was simply nostalgia. They tried telling themselves that everyone occasionally remembers the past. Yet deep down, they knew there was something different about this. Ordinary memories do not carry this kind of emotional weight. Ordinary memories do not keep returning with the same quiet determination. And listen to this. The harder they tried to dismiss it, the more noticeable it became. Not because the memory was demanding attention, but because it was connected to something they had never fully processed. Something they thought they understood, but perhaps never truly did. Every attempt to push it away seemed to make it stronger. Every effort to move beyond it seemed to bring new questions to the surface. Questions they had never asked themselves before, because your heart needs this right now. Sometimes the mind wants closure long before the heart is ready to provide it. Sometimes people convince themselves they have moved on simply because they have learned how to stop looking backward. But moving forward and understanding the past are not always the same thing. This person is beginning to realize that now what once felt like a simple memory has become something much larger. It has become a mystery they cannot fully explain, a feeling they cannot easily dismiss, a reminder that certain moments leave deeper marks than we realize at the time. And although they still don't fully understand why this memory refuses to leave their mind, they are starting to suspect that it isn't the memory itself that matters most. It's what the memory has been trying to reveal all along. And listen to this, because eventually they stopped asking why the memory kept returning and started asking a completely different question. What was this memory trying to show them? That question changed everything. Up until that point, they had been treating the memory like an interruption, something unexpected, something inconvenient, something they needed to move past. But once they stopped resisting it and started paying attention, they noticed details they had never noticed before. The memory wasn't standing alone. It was connected to emotions, realizations, and truths they had overlooked when the moment originally happened. At first, they simply sat with the memory longer than usual. Instead of pushing it away, they allowed themselves to explore it. They replayed it carefully. They looked at it from different angles. And what surprised them most was how differently it appeared now compared to years ago. Back then, it felt ordinary. Back then, it seemed like just another moment among many others. But viewed through the lens of time, the same memory carried an entirely different meaning. What once looked small now seemed significant. What once felt temporary now felt lasting, because your heart needs this right now. Sometimes we don't recognize the importance of a moment while we're living it. We only understand its value after enough time has passed for us to see the bigger picture. This person is beginning to understand that some of the moments they dismissed too quickly may have mattered far more than they realized. And listen carefully. As they reflected, they started noticing something unusual. The memory wasn't bringing sadness. It wasn't bringing regret. It was bringing awareness. Awareness of how much they had changed. Awareness of how certain experiences had shaped them. Awareness of how some people leave an impact that continues influencing our lives long after they are gone. The memory had become less about the past and more about understanding the present. What made this realization so powerful was that it forced them to reconsider things they thought they already understood. For years, they believed they had a clear understanding of what that chapter of their life meant. They thought they knew why things happened the way they did. They thought they had already learned every lesson the experience had to offer. Yet now new insights were appearing. New perspectives were emerging. The memory was revealing layers of meaning they had never seen before, because your heart needs this right now. Growth has a way of changing the way we view old experiences. The same memory can teach different lessons at different stages of life. What once seemed insignificant can later become meaningful. What once seemed confusing can later become clear. This person is discovering that truth through every reflection. And listen to this. The more they examined the memory, the more they realized it was connected to something deeper than a single moment. It was connected to a person who had influenced them in ways they never fully acknowledged. It was connected to emotions they had underestimated. It was connected to lessons that continued shaping their choices, their perspective, and even the way they viewed relationships long afterward. Suddenly, the memory was no longer about remembering what happened. It was about understanding why it still mattered. Now they are beginning to see that this memory was never trying to pull them backward. It wasn't asking them to relive the past. It was asking them to understand it. And that understanding is leading them toward a truth they have avoided for longer than they realize. A truth that becomes clearer every time the memory returns. Because sometimes a memory refuses to leave our mind, not because it belongs to the past, but because it still has something important to teach us in the present. And listen carefully, because this is where the situation began to affect them in a way they never anticipated. Up until now, they had treated the memory as something separate from their daily life. It would appear unexpectedly, linger for a while, and then fade into the background again. But recently, that pattern started changing. The memory was no longer visiting occasionally. It had become part of their quiet moments, part of their reflections, part of the conversations they had with themselves when nobody else was around. And what surprised them most was not the memory itself, but how much meaning they continued finding within it every time it returned. At first, they thought they had already uncovered everything there was to understand. They believed they had reflected enough. They believed they had learned whatever lesson the memory was trying to teach. Yet every time it resurfaced, a new realization seemed to emerge. A detail they once overlooked suddenly became important. A feeling they once ignored suddenly made sense. It was as though time had slowly been removing layers, revealing something much deeper hidden beneath the surface all along. Because your heart needs this right now. Sometimes the most important truths do not arrive all at once. They arrive gradually, piece by piece, until eventually the full picture becomes impossible to ignore. This person is experiencing that process right now. What began as a simple memory has become a source of understanding that continues unfolding with every reflection. And listen to this. One of the biggest surprises has been realizing how often they measure present experiences against feelings connected to that memory. Not intentionally, not consciously. It simply happens. A conversation reminds them of something they once felt. A situation reminds them of a lesson they learned. A moment of connection reminds them of a standard that was quietly established long ago. They never planned for this comparison to exist, yet it continues appearing in subtle ways. The reason this matters is because it has forced them to recognize something they previously missed. Certain experiences leave temporary impressions. Others become part of the way we see the world. This memory appears to belong to the second category. It has remained alive because it became woven into their understanding of what matters, what feels meaningful, and what leaves a lasting impact. They are beginning to understand that some people influence us long after the moments themselves have ended, because your heart needs this right now. Life has a way of revealing value through absence. Sometimes we only recognize the significance of something after enough time has passed for us to experience life without it. This person has lived through countless new experiences since then. They have met new people. They have entered new chapters. They have grown and changed in ways they never expected. Yet through all those changes, this memory remained. Not frozen in time, but evolving alongside them. And listen carefully. The more they grow, the more the memory seems to grow with them. Lessons they couldn't understand years ago suddenly make perfect sense. Emotions they once struggled to define now feel clear. Perspectives they never considered before have begun reshaping the way they view the entire connection. It is no longer just a memory of what happened. It has become a reflection of how much they have learned, how much they have changed, and how much influence that chapter continues to hold over their life. What makes this realization so powerful is that they are no longer searching for reasons to dismiss it. They are no longer telling themselves it means nothing. They are no longer trying to explain it away as simple nostalgia. Instead, they are allowing themselves to acknowledge what the memory has been demonstrating all along. Certain people leave an impact that survives every distraction, every new experience, and every passing year. Not because we refuse to move forward, but because their presence contributed something meaningful to our journey. Because your heart needs this right now. The strongest memories are not always connected to the biggest events. Often they survive because they are attached to moments that changed us in ways we didn't recognize at the time. This person is finally beginning to see that. They are beginning to understand that the reason this memory refuses to leave their mind is not because it belongs to the past. It is because its influence still exists in the present. And now, after all this reflection, one truth is becoming impossible to ignore. The memory remained because the connection mattered. The memory survived because it carried something real. And with every passing day, they are finding it harder to deny that what they once considered a small part of their story may have actually been one of the chapters that shaped them the most. And listen to this, because after all the questions, all the reflection, and all the unexpected moments when that memory returned, they have finally reached a place they never thought they would reach. For the longest time, they believed the memory itself was the mystery. They thought the challenge was figuring out why it kept appearing. They thought the problem was understanding why it refused to disappear like so many other memories had. But now they are beginning to realize something completely different. The memory was never the real message. The memory was simply the messenger. For months, maybe even years, they viewed that moment as a random piece of the past that somehow survived longer than expected. Yet every time they revisited it, it seemed to point toward the same truth. A truth they weren't ready to see before. A truth they couldn't fully understand until life had given them enough experience to recognize it. The memory wasn't asking to be remembered. It was asking to be understood. And those are two very different things, because your heart needs this right now. Sometimes life places a lesson inside a memory and waits patiently for us to become the person capable of understanding it. The lesson remains hidden until the timing is right. The memory returns not to create pain, confusion, or regret, but to reveal something that was missed the first time around. This person is finally beginning to see what was hidden beneath the surface all along, and listen carefully. The more they accepted the memory instead of fighting it, the clearer everything became. They stopped treating it like an unfinished chapter. They stopped viewing it as an emotional puzzle that needed solving. Instead, they started recognizing it as evidence. Evidence that some connections leave permanent marks on our lives. Evidence that some experiences continue influencing us long after they end. Evidence that certain people become part of our personal growth in ways we may never fully appreciate while they're present. What surprised them most was how peaceful this realization felt. They expected answers to bring emotional turmoil. They expected clarity to create more questions. Instead, the opposite happened. The moment they stopped resisting the truth, a sense of understanding began replacing the confusion. For the first time, they weren't asking why the memory survived. They already knew the answer. It survived because it was connected to something meaningful. It survived because it represented a moment, a lesson, and a person who mattered far more than they initially realized. Because your heart needs this right now. There comes a point when a person stops measuring significance by how long something lasted and starts measuring it by how deeply it changed them. This person has reached that point. They are beginning to understand that some of the most important chapters in life are not always the longest. Sometimes they are the chapters that continue teaching us lessons years after they seem finished. And listen to this. The truth that memory has been carrying all along is finally impossible to ignore. It wasn't trying to pull them backward. It wasn't trying to keep them stuck in the past. It was reminding them of something real, something valuable, something that left a lasting impression on who they became. The memory endured because the connection carried meaning. The feeling remained because the impact was genuine. And now, after every distraction, every attempt to move forward, and every effort to convince themselves it no longer mattered, they finally understand what that memory has been trying to show them from the very beginning. Some people enter our lives, leave their mark on our hearts, and quietly become part of our story forever. And no matter how much time passes, the memories connected to those people never truly fade, because they were never meant to. They were meant to remind us of something our soul recognized long before our mind was ready to understand it.